our second Couture live panel discussion of the day, and we're going to be talking about the Bouchra Jarrar shows. It's a very different context for a conversation than our Chanel discussion this morning, because Bouchra is obviously a very young label. It's been around since 2010, and I have an incredible set of panellists with me who are going to introduce themselves, starting with
Tara. My name is Tara Dougans, and I'm currently working in-house to cover Couture for the week. Moving very slowly, but if you check in tomorrow, you can see me in silence for 7 hours straight. Yeah.
I'm Alex Fury. I'm the former fashion director of SHOWstudio, and I'm now editor of Love magazine.
I'm Deborah Milner. I'm a couture designer, and I also work as a consultant for various other brands, including Alexander McQueen.
I want to start by talking about sort of the meat and potatoes of couture, if you can put it as crudely as that, and what goes into making couture as opposed to ready-to-wear, because I think it's something that a lot of people perhaps don't realise, that what marks couture out is actually this idea of kind of the real sort of meticulous workmanship. So Deborah, this is kind of your forte, because as you said, you work in sort of that side of couture. So what marks couture out from ready-to-wear?
I think it's primarily the construction and the techniques that you're able to use. I mean, you're able to use a lot of handwork, which you wouldn't be able to do in ready-to-wear so much. And then also probably the embellishment, the embroidery. Although I personally think that a more modern approach going forward is to really concentrate on the construction and perhaps for the embellishment to take a back step for a while.
Do you think it's quite interesting talking about a designer like Bouchra, because that's kind of what she's done, it is about the cut, it's about the tailoring, it's not about, I think she's done one beaded piece since she started showing, and she's done, this is her 7th season. So do you think that's kind of what a new client for couture is interested in? Who's buying couture? Is that what they want? Do they want tailoring?
I don't know necessarily, because I think there's still a lot of clients who are looking for the embellishment and to see that richness. I think probably the younger clientele are maybe looking for something with interesting cut and construction.
Why do you think young people are excited by couture? Because I think there is this definite vibe that people think of it as kind of, it's what we talked about in some of our other panels, this chance to just show off like absolutely wondrous things. Alex called it the Formula One of fashion. I think that's a really nice way of putting it. And do you think that's what draws people in, is the sense of wonder?
I suppose. I think, that it's natural that sort of embellishment and the quality and craft, how that sort of manifests itself into a more elaborate story for the brand. And I think that perhaps is where your imagination can be captured, is that it sort of goes a little bit deeper into perhaps the designer's mind, or where the inspiration is coming from. It really sort of sets the stage for a collection, maybe perhaps more than ready-to-wear, where, as we were talking earlier, before you guys came in, we were discussing sort of about what kind of commercial implications can do to a design collection. And perhaps when there's a little bit more room for leeway, there's more room for, indeed, wonder.
So where does a designer like Bouchra come in then, who is much more about this stripped back tailoring, and her ready-to-wear was kind of born from her one-to-one personal work? Where do you see her sort of fitting into today's couture?
I think it's interesting for a designer like Bouchra, because she's, as you said, she's a young couture house, and as opposed to going down, it's odd that she worked for Christian Lacroix, because as opposed to going down the route that Lacroix went, which was very much this kind of embroidered, embellished, extremely elaborate and extremely evening wear focused route, very much what Bouchra has become known for is a kind of pragmatism in her day wear. It's sort of the coats that she creates, and also abstracting elements from those coats, introducing them into dresses, and it's a very tailored look. It's a very realistic look as well, and it's sort of something that I commented on one of the other panels, that it's something that couture was really known for. Particularly, I think it was when we were discussing Dior, the fact that Dior's day wear tailoring was obviously incredibly accomplished during his time, but since then the focus has been on evening wear and on red carpet dressing. It's very interesting to see Bouchra amongst couture, because she's really catering for real customers, and she's catering for what the others are ignoring, which is this kind of everyday life. And after we discussed last time, I had some comments on Twitter saying that, couture isn't about dressing women for every day. And I maintain that it is. If there's a woman that's willing to spend £70,000 on an evening dress, she's probably willing to spend £20,000 on a day suit. They're not necessarily looking for razzle dazzle and for embellishment. What they're looking for is the exquisite craftsmanship that couture can offer, and the fit that couture can offer, and the technique that couture can offer, and that's as applicable to day clothing as it is to evening.
I would like to talk a little bit about who is buying couture now, and this idea of the shopper, because this idea of day to evening wear, something that a woman can wear to the office, to work, right through to the evening. It's not, as you say, something you apply to couture, but we've seen it in Dior, and we've seen it also in Chanel. There is always that mix of day to evening wear, and now seeing it in Bouchra. And do you think that is where couture needs to be relevant? And that's actually where couture's roots were. As you said, we used to see that in the earlier couture presentations. It wasn't just kind of the Givenchy model of these beautiful red carpet dresses. Do you think that's what other designers should be doing?
I mean, I think it's unusual because as Deborah works in couture for ready-to-wear houses, but in creating, I guess, these one-off amazing evening dresses for them, which draw on these couture techniques probably far more than their day clothing, which is perhaps more pragmatic. And I think it's probably safe to say with McQueen, as you mentioned, the couture tends to be focused on their evening clothes, because that's where you can really push those techniques and create something extraordinary, whereas the day wear relates much more probably to the core of what they're actually going to be selling. Would you say that was true?
I think it depends on who the client is, really. I mean, I can't speak too much for McQueen, but I know that they have a broad spectrum of clients, which would go from, somebody wearing a dress to collect, an award or something in the daytime, or a suit for a wedding or something. So they do have a broad spectrum, but probably like most couture houses, I would say that the majority of couture garments are evening wear.
I'd like to bring the discussion around to this idea, which is something that we've seen across fashion, which is what people are actually buying. Because I think it's very easy for people to dismiss couture, as we all kind of said, as something that's kind of otherworldly and fantastical and not actually ever going to be relevant to real life. But there is this kind of slow fashion movement, if you equate it to the slow food movement, of people buying, bespoke and spending a bit more money on something that is perfect and tailored to them, rather than this kind of trend-focused pieces that you get in the ready-to-wear. And do you think someone like Bouchra is actually quite a savvy model to build your business on that? Is this something that we're going to start to see other designers doing, moving into just doing bespoke? Good question.
I mean, I think it's odd because very few designers make the distinction between couture and ready-to-wear. They may do things that are one-off for clients, I think, that aren't, they wouldn't necessarily peg as couture, because I think when we start to talk about couture in the French meaning of the term haute couture, it's this whole idea of acceptance by the chambre syndicale. It's about showing in Paris, it's about showing specific collections at specific times. The rules used to be much more rigid. Today they've been relaxed in terms of the number of garments you show per season and the number of people you employ, but they still physically exist. There are still rules that you have to apply to be classed as an haute couturier. Even, for instance, with people like Valentino and with Versace, who don't maintain ateliers in Paris, they're kind of called correspondent members, because they have ateliers but they're not based in Paris. So I think there is a distinction to be made between bespoke garments, which might use couture workmanship, and also even couture, people that have been trained in the craft of couture, and true haute couture in kind of the Parisian sense of the term. I also think it's interesting to look at people like Le Marier, the feather specialist, Lesage, the embroiderers, Goossens, Mazzaro, which are all owned by Chanel, but they work probably far more for ready-to-wear houses than they do for haute couture, which is this idea of ready-to-wear pushing itself so far that actually a designer garment, that it might be ostensibly a ready-to-wear label, but they are producing clothes that are couture in everything but name. It's everything except that label.
So why does couture with the label, how is that going to keep its relevance? And if we're not seeing brands like McQueen, where some of that evening wear, is, as you say, it's couture in how it's made, it's couture in the technique, but it's not couture in the sense it's not showing at Couture Week. How is the actual Couture Week going to keep its relevance?
I think it's through, they've always talked about the strength of these core houses. Oddly enough, one of the core houses was Givenchy, which has stopped showing couture this season. And I think it's this sort of French tradition of brands that label themselves as couture houses and that show as part of Couture Week. It's difficult to say how is it going to exist, because maybe the question is more if it's going to continue to exist. Dior have said that they will stop showing couture if Chanel stops showing couture. It's which is sort of, it all interrelates, I think, with Haute Couture Week. It's this idea that it's a separate week to the rest of the fashion week. So if you're showing a collection in Haute Couture Week, you're getting more attention. It's marked out as something completely different, and people can have discussions like this about its relevance. And I guess it's about making it into something special, and that's really what couture is about. It's about making incredibly special garments.
I think we'll lose some of the techniques if the couture houses disappear, because then even if there's a house doing couture, it's still not going to be the focus of that house. It's not going to be, if they're just making a few couture pieces, it's not like making a specific couture collection, having the whole kind of rigmarole of seeing the clients in a certain way, presenting what you're doing in a certain way, and also just the way that the workroom's set up. You work in a different way if you're making a couture.
Can you talk us through that a little bit? Because obviously this is your background, and it's so fascinating, I think, for people who don't, as you say, the workroom, the techniques. What kind of a way is it?
Well, obviously I'm not working, when I work in my own studio, it's not like working in a French couture house. So, it's still not the same setup, I have to say, because then you have very strict rules. People are wearing white coats. There's a kind of whole hierarchy in terms of what you actually do and who, how you start working in the house, what's your first job. So unfortunately I can't talk too much about that because I haven't actually worked in a French couture house. But just in terms of the techniques that you're using, if you're making a dress, you're probably going to back the fabric by hand on a different fabric. You wouldn't even use a machine, because if you use a machine, you get a different finish. So there's all sorts of things like that. And, just the time that you've got to develop the techniques. I'm sure that unless you're a very unusual house like McQueen, I'm sure that there's going to be constant pressure on maybe doing it a quicker way.
Yeah.
And maybe that is the future of couture, but I still think there's something special about having that opportunity to really take the time on each piece and make it something incredible.
And that's actually something that's really interesting about Bouchra, as we kind of hinted at before, and that Alex mentioned, she did do her stint in the couture side at Le Croix, and she also spent time at Balenciaga, so she has kind of really, as much as it's a new couture house, she's approached it in that kind of very quite sort of deferential, traditional way of really honing her craft in this anonymous way at other houses, and I think that's what makes her work seem really, really special. Do you think that there are the same opportunities though for young people who want to get into that route? Can you even train in that way anymore?
Well, I guess you could if you went to train in a couture house for a start, or if you train in a very good fashion house where they have a really innovative and interesting workroom, then I think you're going to learn a lot of couture techniques. As I say, I haven't actually worked in Paris, but I've picked up a lot of couture techniques. I'm learning all the time, even now, and that's through working with different people in the industry, and it depends where your focus is. If you're interested in that, you're going to keep finding out more about it. And in fact, in my own instance, I found that working with costume makers has actually pushed what I'm doing a lot further forward, because a lot of the techniques that they use, the best ones, are still sort of old couture techniques. Albeit, you know,
Or
maybe
even,
adapted.
I mean, some predate couture.
So
I know
exactly.
with,
I mean,
making kind of hose for Shakespearean theatre. If they're doing it properly, it's by bias cutting them, which is how they did it in the Middle Ages,
Right.
and it's kind of how you get with, I think, with kind of the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the whole idea is if you're dressing in the way that they dressed when they originally acted these plays, somehow it affect, which I think is very true. If you're dressing in garments that affect your body in the way that they affected, it makes you move in a different way, it makes you act in a different way, it makes you hold yourself differently.
the one thing that we haven't touched on, which is really important and could be lost if there aren't any big couture houses, is the art of fitting. Because that is what makes, after all the techniques and everything else, it's whether you've got a good fitter and whether they know how to translate that fitting onto the pattern. Because you can go and stick pins in anything, any old way you like, but actually being able to take that garment and look at the paper or the fabric and translate that onto the fabric is a whole different thing. And, you know, those ladies or men, they know about fitting for different figures, and that's why in my own business I've ended up working a lot with the costume makers, because they know how to fit, because they're still fitting different figures every day, whereas you'll find in general in a ready-to-wear house doesn't go for McQueen
You fit a model
necessarily,
figure,
but
I
you're
think.
fitting a model figure.
I'm interested because
So-
Tara, you spent the sort of past 2 days, as you said, looking at the couture collections in this immense detail because you're drawing one look. And is that something you've noticed? You know, is that something that is that perfect fit and that perfect detail? Because you illustrate in quite a couture way. You know, you spend your whole day and it's perfect and everything's. Has it been a nice subject to draw?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think the more intricacy, the more fun it is, and the larger challenge it is as well. And I think for me personally, and even just hearing what you said as well, you're talking about the art of fit, but also like the art of cloth. And it seems to me that perhaps the relevancy is just maintaining that, the art of it, and from an illustration perspective, that will be what always makes couture something more interesting to draw, because that artfulness, I think, translate to what I'm working on and to the depictions as well.
Bouchra's images are in from her show, so should we have a look? We've got the opening look then, which, as we said, you know, it's very signature Bouchra in the sense of this focus on, you know, the tailoring and the day wear and the cut. I'll flick through, but tell me if you would like to stop. And you know, Alex, I know you love Le Croix, so but talk to us about how different this is to what Le Croix did, because obviously she trained there.
I mean, I think it's, from the outset, it looks incredibly different just because Le Croix is known for sort of the embellishment. But it was quite interesting what Tara was just saying, because one of the things that Le Croix said when he first set up his house in 1987 was that he had to gather work people around him that could construct his drawings exactly as he drew them. He actually technically didn't know how to make the clothes, but the people that he brought in people that had kind of left Dior. He worked at Pateau, and he brought in a lot of people that had left Pateau as well. When he there was a slight scandal that he abandoned Pateau and set up his own house, and they sued him. But when he left, a lot of people got sacked, and Le Croix brought them in. So there were these people that had incredible experience with working with Cristobal Balenciaga and Christian Dior himself.
That's amazing.
And pulling those people in. But what Le Croix said was that he needed these people around him that could construct his sketches exactly as he drew them. And I think there is something when you look at this, that kind of the crispness of the lines. And you can imagine that it's translating a sketch quite literally, as opposed to, again, to kind of, as you said, I know a lot about Le Croix and I really love Le Croix. Le Croix did say that for him there was a dress that emerged in the last 2 weeks of the collection, which were dresses that were just about fabric, and it was about folding fabric around the body and letting the fabric live its own life. Whereas I think with these dresses, they're very strict, they're very tailored, and they're very precise. So you can imagine that this is about Bouchra really pushing the tailoring workshops that she works with to realise exactly what she wants. There's a lot of precision to her work, I think, which here again she's emphasising with different kind of graphic patterns. I mean, if these weren't cut correctly and if they weren't dealt with a couture hand, it's doubtful they would look quite as precise as they do.
And she does speak with a lot of sort of deference to what you were seeing in couture, kind of in the earlier stages. She talks about, you know, the 50s and the 60s as something that's very dear to her work. And I think even if it isn't just the precision, you do see that.
I mean, the interesting thing as well is she doesn't, for all the references and for the fact that she's working in couture, she doesn't get mired down in kind of the history of couture. You never feel that it's weighing down her work and that it's anything. It isn't a costume drama or anything like that. There's always a modernity to what she's proposing, and I have seen women wearing her clothes, and you wouldn't. I think another great thing about Bouchra's work is its subtlety. You wouldn't immediately recognise quite how perfect the piece. You don't realise how perfectly kind of the coat is doing its job unless you kind of look at the inside of it and really examine it. It's just kind of, it's a great garment, and I think in that way it's quite different to La Croix, which is about this kind of, you know, embellishment and embroidery and very much that evening wear element of couture and kind of the drama of couture, whereas Bouchra is much quieter.
Have you seen them close up then? Have you looked inside?
Bouchra's, yes, I have. And I was.
And do you think? And are they made by hand or are they made in a factory?
No, it is made by hand. Because she has. I actually thought it was. I think because it's so quiet, I wasn't sure if it was when I first went to it. I thought she was presenting ready to wear in couture, which obviously a few people do for that whole idea of getting attention. But there is, although stylistically there are similarities, I think that the technique marks it out. It's incredibly made. It's beautifully made. Her clothes are really exquisite. And again, I think it's that wonderful. I keep harking back to a French tradition, but for me, she's an incredibly French designer. She doesn't speak any English. It's, you know, she's very much in that old tradition of sort of Chanel, Jean Dessay, Pateau, Jacques Fath. Actually, she's very similar to Jacques Fath. There's a lot of asymmetry in her work, and a lot of kind of contrasts of colour. It's not very embellished. It's not very rich in a superficial tone, but there's incredible fabric quality to it, and there's something really sort of satisfying about that, I think. And it, again, it's this idea of appealing to a different customer. Or at least appealing to a different part of a customer's life, I guess.
Why is she such a... Because she is a rare bird in a sense. You don't see the model that she's done, which is this, you know, as I think you put it so right when you said she doesn't get wrapped up in kind of the history and the tradition of couture. Like, she's very respectful of it, but she is very forward thinking, and she's very sort of true to what she does well and very confident. But, you know, we're not seeing this great barrage of other houses being set up that focus on this more kind of realistic wearable couture. Is it just because those people don't have the kind of training that Bouchra has? Why aren't we seeing that?
To be honest, I'm surprised that there's a huge market for it, having argued for its validity and how valuable I think it is. I think it's quite difficult to explain to somebody why a plain coat costs as much as an embroidered coat or something like that in the couture. And I think you have a house like Chanel that does it, but of course with Chanel you have the sort of the heft of the name behind it, and it's also very much part of Chanel's tradition. And I think with a lot of couture houses, what people are buying into is they are buying into the name, and they are, by buying a Dior couture, somehow you're buying into that. You're there's a certain degree of sort of cultural capital attached to it. By buying Dior couture today, you're still buying into the new look from 1947. There is this link behind it. There's the fact that it's coming from the same workroom. It's being created in the same place. There's the idea that this hallowed cloth has been touched by the same creative hands. And I think for a new house to be set up around that, and also to be set up without the sort of hype that came with La Croix being set up in 87, because there was La Croix in 87, and then Thierry Mugler and Jean-Paul Gaultier in 96, 97. And really after then there's only been Bouchra, I think, as kind of a new name in haute couture.
You've got your irises.
And but again, not having that kind of the heft of those names behind them. Even Gaultier and Mugler had been working for 20 years by the time they set up their couture houses, or by the time they started producing haute couture rather. So I think for Bouchra she really has to be proposing something fresh and something new, and something that you can't get from other houses. Sorry, I'm rabbiting.
No, I don't know if I should say.
No, say what you're going to say.
Well, it's fresh and it's new because it's in couture, but is it that fresh and new if you saw it with the ready-to-wear collections?
But she does have a ready-to-wear, which is, again, really beautiful, really striking. But I think what's special about her work, it's what Alex was saying, it is that precision that you get with a coat where you don't quite realise it's doing its job, and then when you actually sort of touch and feel it. It would be nice actually if we kind of, because we picked apart, Alex, you picked up on obviously the asymmetry, which she's always kind of been quite interested with. But what are your kind of initial thoughts on the collection?
I mean, actually, echoing what Deborah was just saying, it's sort of what Bouchra always does, which is, it's not a great move away from her signature style, which is this asymmetric wrapping. There's always something a bit Napoleonic to it.
I mean, maybe that doesn't matter because Madame Grey did a similar, take on what she did for the whole of her career, and yet it was amazing.
I also think there is something with it being French. There's a great deal of I think there is a great deal of national pride in France about one of the things they loved about Nicolas Ghesquière was the fact that he was a Frenchman in a French house, and there's this kind of staunch pride, and I think that's especially true of haute couture. It's this thing that's made in Paris, and it's it's a French art form. The fact that it was created by an Englishman is completely forgotten all the time.
Say that.
No, I was watching that Mr. Selfridge thing, and I just kept thinking it would be so much better if this was Charles Frederick Worth.
Yes.
That's the story that you really should be telling. It's much more interesting.
I want to bring up Mr. Selfridge on one of these panels. I knew.
But Charles Frederick Worth would be so much more interesting. A story, this guy from Lincolnshire that goes and sets up modern fashion, creates modern fashion. It's amazing, and obviously. But that's another thing. I kind of think it has to be somebody from outside to go in and sort of smash apart these sort of traditions of fashion, because then it's weird to talk about, because when Charles Frederick Worth went and set up haute couture, it was actually culturally unacceptable for a man to measure a woman for a garment unless it was a riding habit or a corset. Those were Louis XIV decreed that those were the only garments that a man could make for a woman and could measure her for, and the rest had to be made by women. It was Parisian law. And then Charles Frederick Worth just went and sort of ripped it all apart, and also set up this whole idea of a designer telling you what you were going to wear, a designer as kind of auteur and author of fashion, as opposed to you collaborating with them to sort of create what you wanted. But in a weird way, the appeal of haute couture was the fact that the client gets that chance, as opposed to ready to wear when you go and buy a manufactured garment. And I think this is also the appeal probably of bespoke and of things being custom made, is the idea that you work with the client, and if they need straps to support a bodice, then you work with them and design something that works with the garment, or if it's better in red than in white, or if they want it to be below the knee rather than above the knee. That was, I mean, in the sort of in the 1980s, what was lauded as the kind of the advantage of haute couture over ready to wear was the fact that the client could have an authorship of their garment. Whereas I think today, with houses like the people that you work with, they actually offer that to a client. It's the idea of
that is
giving
the
a
great
couture
thing about
service.
couture. And then often people come to you anyway with a kind of, you know, a guide as to what they want. So it's like a new design brief. We've got to design something for them.
So kind of reworking
So-
a piece from the collection,
Yeah.
and it ends up, I guess, being completely different because of how
but
they've
obviously you've got
designed
to keep the kind of essence of the house that you're working with. But
which I think is almost more challenging than presenting a collection where it's the ideas that you feel are right for now, because it's actually someone telling you,
it
well,
is
your
in some
ideas
ways.
weren't quite right, this is what I think they should be. So it's that idea of trying to keep your own identity while satisfying somebody else,
Yeah.
which is the incredibly challenging, I think.
I think that is incredibly challenging.
I'm interested that you mentioned worth, and I don't want to get you going too much.
Because we know that's tragic and we'll be here until
No,
midnight.
but I'm glad, because there is this idea, and perhaps this is me being unfair, but I think these kind of couturiers were so important and just kind of forgotten by fashion, not fashion history, but kind of left out of a broader fashion narrative. But I think
Deborah's looking through a Charles James book, which is the
I
perfect
was just gonna
example
say,
of
wasn't
forgotten
he,
couturier.
and also I think Jean Lanvin as well. You know, people. I think it's because Coco Chanel is the fashion woman, but like
Jean Patel.
exactly. And I feel like where's that? Why is that their kind of space in fashion, popular fashion history? Perhaps, God, that's really. But it's forgotten in a sense.
Well, I think if we're talking about Chanel, is Chanel really remembered for Chanel Haute Couture, or is Chanel remembered for Chanel No. 5?
Yeah.
You know, Dior's remembered for the new look, and even if people don't really know what that means, they sort of know that Dior did something in the 40s, and you know, it's and also I think there's that idea of Dior did something in the 40s, and I can still buy the perfume and the dresses, and it's that idea of a name outliving its founder, a fashion label outliving its founder.
I must admit though, I mean, once I went with Philip Tracy years ago when we were really quite young, when he was doing hats for Chanel, and he took me with him as his assistant, basically, so I could, you know, see how the couture house worked. And what was really amazing was that, first of all, they didn't use a fabric that wouldn't work for the design. So it's quite different in terms of, you know, what sort of a lot of designers, young designers do, or designers like McQueen or myself in earlier days would try and make something out of plastic or whatever, which I think is really exciting. But it was interesting to see that the reason all those coats and jackets worked so beautifully is because it was exactly the right fabric for the design. And I went up and I talked to Monsieur Paquito, you know, the very famous old tailor, and I was sort of worried at the time that I was taking ages to alter patterns and things like that, and he showed me this new shoulder he was doing, and he told me that it had taken 12 twirls to get it right, and all he'd actually changed was he'd put a strip along the shoulder and down the sleeve, but to get that perfect it took 12 twirls.
Was like
so I
Charles
was quite
James,
encouraged by that, I have to say.
I
Thinking that's okay then.
I think Charles James took a year and $100,000 in 1950 something on a sleeve.
Yeah.
And Chanel used to slice them out.
But that's why some of the garments are so beautifully cut, and I think it's quite hard to find that in modern fashion, that degree of perfection in cutting. I think.
Do you still think we get it in the modern couture that we're seeing?
Yes, some of it. I mean, then you've got to. Then the question is whether how exciting the designs are. But definitely the skill of, say, Chanel at cutting a jacket is unsurpassed when you see it.
I mean, the thing
why can you lift your arm up as high as that? Well, the reason is they've got tiny armholes. But when you put it on, it's really comfortable because you can move. It doesn't feel constricting.
Which is also, it's weird when you were talking about sewing, because there is that weird. Hand sewing has more elasticity than a machine stitch, which is so weird to say until it's in a garment, and then it's like, actually you can do more and you can make the dress do more. Bias cut is better cut by hand because it will allow the fabric to move more. It's these tiny details which aren't about covering something in embroidery.
And especially if you were going to make something like this dress. I mean, the reason that you can mould it and make the dress look like that is because you're putting all the layers on by hand like you would on a sculpture. So, you know, the underlayers will be less, and you can kind of, like tailoring, you can kind of mould the fabric as you're going along. So it's kind of like bespoke tailoring, I suppose, a lot of the similar techniques.
I think as well there's something that should be said about couture, which is, I haven't seen myself, but I saw the fantastic documentary The House of Chanel by Loic Prigent, which is like about 5 hours long or
I
something.
haven't seen that. My friend said it's amazing.
Wonderful.
I really want to see
It's
it.
sensational, and it's the idea that you'll know, of course, which is that they don't cut in the flat, that they do it by building fabric onto a mannequin, and then they take the fabric off and cut the pattern from that. So it's the idea that it's actually fabric determining the shape of the garment. And I mean, the thing that I found amazing was you could imagine that with a bias cut evening dress or something form-fitting, but they were making crinolines, and they were making them by pinning pieces of tulle onto a mannequin to form these amazing crinolines, and then cutting them again and again.
I mean, the difficulty is that then when you come to repeat it, you haven't got the pattern to follow. Because I mean, some of the things that I've made that I like best, it was really difficult to do it again because I hadn't necessarily made a pattern.
Do you get the sense of that when you're drawing them, Tara? Do you look at it and you get this idea of the kind of the hours and and just the amount of precision that's gone into it? Or do you think, because some of the collections you've been quite embellishment focused, haven't they?
You definitely do, and actually my biggest frustration is that you can't get photographs that get the level of detail that you want, because even if you're up this close, you have this feeling that there's so much more, and even underneath, if you were to lift it up, in a way it's actually kind of frustrating because you almost want to feel it. Like if I like to touch things, and I sort of feel like I want to get more into it, and so
you have to make your case to go and
I think that's what's interesting about the construction side of it. Well, obviously embroidery is construction as well, but there you can really see the work. But with the construction, you can't necessarily see it unless you know what you're looking at, because the other thing is how to make the couture garment so that at the end of it, it looks quite effortless and doesn't look like you've spent maybe 200 hours on it, because if it does, it's going to look old and dowdy and maybe too heavy.
What's really interesting about Bouchra is because you do get that sense of how it does seem so effortless, and maybe that is the context of doing all that asymmetrical sort of cutting that she does, but you never look at it and get the sense of it, as you say, of it feeling.
But I do wonder, I mean, I haven't seen all the collection yet.
Yes.
And I think there's definitely a place for this sort of couture. I think Alex is right that there's going to be women who want to just be able to invest in a piece that they can wear again and again.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I don't know if you're getting maybe the degree of cutting skill that you would if a Balenciaga was making a Balenciaga or a Charles James. I mean, obviously they would have a certain era. So maybe the question is how relevant
it's that era
are they?
thing, isn't it? Because if you think in those days that was what women wore, whereas for Bouchra, working in the confines.
That's a beautiful
what
piece.
women wear. And I love that pipe.
There you can see more, I think.
It's just so beautiful.
I suppose if you look at Saint Laurent, a lot of his day wear was very much that day wear, just a beautifully cut jacket, but very simple and very wearable and not in your face.
I think there's that as well with some of the Charles James pieces, the sort of the pagoda coat and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The idea that it's, and the thing that Dior said, which is, the well-cut dress is the dress with the fewest cuts. Just the idea that, I mean, that's incredibly simple.
Yes. That's
but
true.
that kind of modernity as well. But I think as well it's that, which I think maybe with Bouchra's work, for a lot of people, that's not what they would see as couture. They wouldn't look at that and think of it as couture. You think of this as couture.
Yeah.
It's which to a degree is true of the way that it's been bought a lot of the time. I remember with John Galliano's first collection for Dior, they said that all the dresses were bestsellers in white because people bought them as wedding dresses.
Oh, right.
It's like,
Well,
just all of the ball
the
gowns,
case
everyone
anyway.
wanted them in white. Which, and I guess that is sort of still the case with the couture, as much as I argue that there will be an audience for these as kind of beautiful beautiful day wear pieces. Couture is generally occasion wear.
That's what interests me with Bouchra, because you think there is so brave in a sense what she's doing, because it is, you do equate couture with evening wear, and there is almost that easy market with the bridal in a sense. So you could get a very chic bride in that.
Yeah.
Very chic.
Deborah, I'm interested, is there a huge demand for, I mean, do you experience a big demand for things that are custom made?
I think there is still on the evening wear front, definitely. Evening wear and wedding, front, definitely.
Well, because Selfridges have just launched their bespoke, and you're seeing that trend for that kind of made-to-measure type. It seems to have a lot of buzz around it. So in the last 2 years or so, everyone's writing about kind of slow fashion, like recession fashion in a sense. If you're going to save up and spend a load of money during a recession, you want it to be something that's perfect to you.
I mean, I guess as much as I'm saying this is day wear, it's actually not.
I suppose trousers, you definitely, to get a good fit in trousers, you need to have them made for you. So then I guess you're going to want the jacket made for you as well.
I mean, I think with this, as much as I'm talking about it as day wear, it's actually, I guess it's what I would like to think people's day wear was. But really it's not. People,
really?
you wear jeans and a t-shirt, you wear jeans and a t-shirt for day, and then you might wear this for an evening out that isn't incredibly dressy, and then you wear this to the Met Ball, and I guess the other thing as well is, of course, with couture, I say the Met Ball and we all laugh, but for couture you still go to balls, that's part of the couture ritual, are these charity functions that a hell of a lot of couture clients go to, which is, in an incredibly cynical sense, a way of justifying spending. I'm giving £400,000 to charity so I can spend £20,000 on an evening dress. And I think there is still that market for these dresses, that there is an occasion, there is a ball, it's something that I should go to.
I'd say more what people are looking at. Because I think the thing is, you're very well served at ready-to-wear level with jackets, suits and trousers and all of those things. But when it comes to an evening dress, for example, it's quite hard to get one that's going to fit you as well, because you're probably going to need your underwear making. So that's the first thing. So I think that's one reason why people are still willing to spend the money on couture at evening wear level.
I'm interested that you say you are well served at ready to wear, for things like the jackets and the trousers, because I think a lot of people would say, ready to wear at the moment, especially, it's quite, trend driven, it's quite showy. Do you think that there are still those houses that are doing, that beautiful, perfectly made, outside of Paris, do you think?
I haven't really looked, to be honest, I should say it. There must be. You must be able to go and get a decent pair of trousers.
I mean, I think you can, but I think I'm always interested in talking about the Met Ball, because for the vast majority, for fashion, that's it. This is what you're buying. If you're buying a ball gown, that's what you're buying it for.
Right.
And it's incredibly well placed versus the couture calendar that it's in May.
Yes.
So if you see a couture dress in January that you really like, they can make it for you by May. And they haven't shown a collection since then, so it's not going to be outdated. And so it kind of, I think it's perfectly timed for you to actually have an amazing dress made specifically for that event. And of course, that's what since the 70s, and when Diana Vreeland started at the Met, it's very much what the ball became about, which is sort of a celebration of fashion. And I don't want to be too cynical and say it's about people, justifying buying these incredible dresses, but it's as much a celebration of contemporary fashion as it is a celebration of historical fashion. And it's kind of a great justification for couture as well. That there are still these grand events to wear them to, and this is obviously an incredibly visible grand event to wear it to.
I mean, the thing about couture as well is it is still, even if you want to talk about couture that other houses are doing where they're making their couture pieces, it is still a great lab in terms of what you're then going to feed down into your other collections. You can develop techniques, you can try them out, you try them out by hand, maybe you're hand painting or whatever. And then later on, it's much easier to find a way of, distilling that into a ready-to-wear outfit, rather than if you started from scratch trying to find something exciting for ready-to-wear from that point of view. So I think, that's a relevance. Also, you're employing people.
And as well as, we talked about this in your discussion, as well as distilling the technique, there's also that idea of distilling, the story and the brand. You can show something fantastical we said this with the dual couture, that'll filter down into, your lipstick and it's the same with Chanel, it's where you put across your your theatrics.
I mean, imagine a world where you didn't have, you know, as you say, the Ferraris, the Jaguars, the absolute top of the range cars. You didn't have any of those top of the range dresses. You didn't have, you know, champagne or whatever. But it wouldn't be as exciting. I don't mind that I can't afford it. I don't have a couture dress. I've never made one for myself. I don't have a Jaguar, but it doesn't worry me that you can buy them.
But fashion gets a harder press than automobiles.
It does. But I think it's very much a kind of laboratory for what then filters down into the whole of the rest of the industry. You only have to look at, you know, Topshop or Zara or whoever. And if you say, oh, well, they're copying the ready-to-wear, yes, they are, but a lot of the ready-to-wear, you know, I mean, in the houses where they make couture is probably developed from their couture. I mean, I'm not trying to say that so many of the ready-to-wear designers are looking at the couture for inspiration, because they're not necessarily. There's only a few who are maybe doing really exciting new designs now.
But I think as well, a thing that you talked earlier about, Deborah, which I think is incredibly important, is the fact that if we hadn't had couture, I mean, Yves Saint Laurent said that he felt that couture was dead in the 70s.
When Balenciaga
if everyone
shut
had
his house.
exactly, and if everyone had said, okay, fine, let's pack up and stop, I think the vast majority of the techniques that we're using today
have all been lost
in ready-to-wear would have been completely lost.
Yeah.
I mean, it's depressing to say we have lost techniques because there aren't. You don't have the physical fabrics to produce them the way that they made clothes in the 18th century. You know, you can't get the workmanship. People don't have the time, even in couture, to create some of the clothes. I mean, I remember when Galliano first started at Dior, there was, I think, one of the most time-consuming dresses Lesage had ever embroidered. It took 3,000 hours to embroider a dress, which was, it's like a Moorish carpet embroidered dress from autumn-winter 1998, because I'm that weird and obsessive. Which even now you don't hear people talking about taking that long to embroider anything, because you can't, physically no one would be able to afford it, and houses aren't willing to put that sort of money into a show the way they were at the end of the 90s. So I think there is this argument that things are dying slightly, but by keeping couture going and by translating those techniques into garments that bear a ready-to-wear label, you're keeping some of that tradition alive. And there are techniques that we're still using that were used hundreds of years ago, and there's something incredibly beautiful about that. I think at least.
There is, definitely.
This idea that you're wearing a dress that's sewn the same way that a dress that Marie Antoinette owned was sewn. You know, there's something, or Empress Eugenie. And again, that's a great thing about couture, this incredible tradition of women and this incredible tradition of craft.
It's the craft, I think, really. It's the craft that will be lost, and that craft does inform the ready-to-wear. Or, you know, if you're clever, you can find ways to develop the techniques so that they can be done in a factory. It won't be the same, but you'll maybe have a different look to the one you'd have had if you never were even aware of that.
But is that really refreshing about Bouchra then? Is at least, you say, you know, we noticed it looks like it could be ready-to-wear in the sense of how sort of day-wear focused it is, but is that something that's quite refreshing, is to see someone try and move those techniques and try and move that focus on craft into a day-wear context? Because that is the most likely way, you know, you're going to see it sort of progress and move forward.
I think it's nice
I
to
don't
see
know
something,
about that.
I mean, I think it's nice to see something stripped back.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a place
and that
for
also
it.
proves that couture doesn't have to be enormous dresses. I mean, I also think the great thing about any couture garment and about anything that's made by hand is something that ready-to-wear can never have, and which sounds incredibly pretentious, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is this idea of emotion that's stitched into the cloth, which is the fact that somebody cares about what they've made.
But that you're not joking there, because the one thing I'd noticed, if you have a day where maybe the seamstress isn't in a good mood, or something's gone wrong in her life, it comes out in the clothing.
Yeah.
It really does. It'll go wrong and it won't quite work.
Stitches are buggered up.
Yeah, seriously. So it does actually matter.
But I think as well, the idea of somebody, I mean, a great thing that I read was when Tom Ford started to design at Yves Saint Laurent. Obviously, he'd worked in the Italian system, which was you sketch something, you send it to a factory, they send you the sample back, you alter it, and you go back and forth with the factory. And then coming into Saint Laurent and working with an in-house atelier, he designed the collection and decided to drop a feather embroidered dress that it had taken a woman 2 months to make, and she walked out because she'd invested so much emotion in making that dress that when he dropped it, she wanted to leave. She couldn't bear to be there anymore, and then he had to coax her back. But I think just the fact of you ordering a piece of clothing and then somebody having to take the care over creating it for somebody else, there is that kind of odd human connection.
Oh, definitely.
Whether you get involved in that whole wonderful couture tradition of sewing hairs inside wedding dresses so you'll get married and that kind of, you know, which again are wonderful kind of stories, but I think physically one person making something for somebody else, and it does tend to be, you know, a select group of craftspeople making something for one person. There's something really wonderful about that. There's this, in this kind of vending machine culture.
There's a great trust between yourself and the client, because obviously you're in quite an intimate position. I mean, you're going to see nearly as much of them as the doctor would see in the end, because normally you're making the underwear for a start.
That's really, that is actually interesting, the beauty, emotion. Should we see some more of So we're getting to the evening wear.
Well, I think the nice thing with Bouchra's work is that there is that balance between it's never purely evening wear, it's never purely day wear, and it's also there is this kind of mix between the two. I think there's a wonderful balance, and it's this very sort of, I keep saying French and traditional, but it is this very French way of being aware of a woman's daily life. And I guess it's quite a French idea of not so much an English idea, perhaps, of spending a lot of money on what you wear every day rather than just an occasion dress.
I think it's very modern. I don't think it's particularly innovative, but I do think that it's very modern, and I definitely think there's a place for making, more simple couture that people could buy for sort of every day.
I'm interested when you say, Alex, that idea of spending a lot of money on something you wear every day, because do you see that with people that come they want something that they're going to get?
No, but I do think there is a place, especially as you're saying, people wanting to invest more in particular garments. For example, being able to buy a great coat. I mean, my coat's in a disgraceful state because I can't find a coat that I like, having said that ready to wear, catered for everything.
Everyone ends up arguing against themselves.
I know, that's really embarrassing.
No, it's good.
I think I was just going to say, I think it's interesting if you can put the issue of price point aside for a minute. Or you're talking about sort of the heart or the trust that would go from the creator into the garment. I think that relationship sort of would automatically transfer to the buyer as well. Because when you're wearing something, or even if you're holding a piece of art, or if you're experiencing a piece of art, there's like this great awareness of the time and effort and thought that went into that piece. And I think that in itself is not a justification, but I think that is sort of perhaps the beauty of couture, and even in this, it's like this perfect intersection of tradition, but also a place where indeed you can experiment and explore, and then to transfer that to someone and they can wear that piece and care about that piece. And for me, that's the value.
Everything else that goes on in fashion.
Well, I think the other interesting thing about couture is you can't separate yourself from the craft, which I think you can do in ready-to-wear. You can go in and an uncaring, I mean, it's difficult for me to perceive of an uncaring high-fashion consumer who can go in and buy an embroidered jacket and then try it on and then throw it on the floor. But they do exist. Whereas with haute couture, you order a piece, you're measured, they fit the toile, you physically see people building this garment for you. You would have to be some sort of psychopath to then sort of not care about that when you've also, there's this idea of people are investing their time in you and you invest your time in them. There are fittings. I don't think it's the same way that it used to be in the 70s and 80s, which was, I remember Nan Kempner saying that she used to set aside 2 weeks of her life to go and be fitted for her clothes every season.
Well,
in
if
Paris.
you're having a few things, you'd have to.
Yeah, exactly. She used to go and she would, take up a suite, and then she'd be in Paris for 2 weeks, visiting the different couturiers and being fitted every day to have a garment built.
Because often with a wedding dress, you can be talking
Well, like you said, 12 12s, you know, like...
You could be.
Mm.
Hopefully you wouldn't be. But you'd be very lucky to get
Yeah.
away with 3 fittings. Sometimes you have to, but that is really not ideal. Especially if you're building a corset or something. You need a couple for those, a couple for the 12, a couple
Yeah.
for the final garment. So if you imagine each fitting's maybe an hour and a half and you've got to get there and have a tea or whatever, you know, if you were having several outfits, you could easily use 2 weeks.
Yeah. But I think so whereas with ready to wear, you can, and I guess people have built this, you know, there are these consumers that maybe are about consumption rather than necessarily wearing the garment. It's, you know, there are lots of people that buy things, and I'm guilty of it myself, buying things and keeping them and not necessarily wearing them. I think with couture it's much more difficult because you've built it and it's been made for you to make you look the best you possibly can, and the first thing you want to do is put that on because it's been made for you. It's perfect for you, so why wouldn't you want to wear something that's
interesting.
ideal?
A lot of people want to actually, if they were having a wedding dress made, a lot of people afterwards want to have it in a museum or to display it or something. I suppose because they appreciate the fact that that artistry has gone into it.
I think that's a really lovely note to end on because it's such a beautiful defence of couture without being defensive, which is what everyone strays into when they're talking about couture, because people feel this need to kind of argue why it should stay. Shall we give Bouchra a round of applause to close things off?